Welcome to the Five Bridges Funding Info Session. Thank you all for joining. Today, I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our two special guests. We have Samantha Crockett from Mount Rogers Community Services and Melissa Ackley from, from Chesterfield County. And I have been working with both of them for some time now with our Five Bridges program, and they have been so successful with finding funding for their programming and finding unique and strategic ways to fund the programs and to make it sustainable that I asked them here today to share their insights to help those of you who might not know where to start and might be asking questions about finding funding. So before we jump in and learn a little bit more about them, let's talk about who you are. So the question comes up a lot about funding and who we serve and who this information is for. So certainly we work with for-profit organizations, and anyone can use Five Bridges, but we serve primarily service organizations. So that can be local governments, coalitions, CSBs, treatment centers, health clinics, nonprofits, hospitals, schools. Basically, if you are in the business of helping other people, our job is to help you. And one of the services that we provide, in addition to programming, is helping you find sustainable funding. Things like logic models and grant templates and things of that nature. Just like we do with the programming or with marketing tools, we want to help you with the heavy lifting. Whether or not you use our program, we want you to be successful in your approach to serving people and doing that in a sustainable way. So if we do work together, in addition to the information that we're going to share today, we would schedule a 15-minute session where we go through the process of planning your funding with Five Bridges, looking at how that works with your current funding models, your current programs, and how that all works together, the process of submitting it, and then the implementation process of the program. And we're going to talk a lot about the integration of programs today and how that works at the different agencies that we work with. We very much believe that there is no one program that is the solution. There's no one size fits all. There's no one agency who can do everything. Collaboration is key. So sharing resources is necessary. The idea of coalitions and using different programs to bolster one another is how I think Samantha and Melissa and other agencies have been so successful. So with that, let's jump into it. Samantha, can you share a little bit about who you are and what you do at Mount Rogers?
Yes, I'm Samantha Crockett, and as Jake said, I am the Director of Behavioral Health Prevention and Wellness Services at Mount Rogers Community Services. And I oversee anything that falls under prevention and wellness, even tobacco cessation. But we put in holistic wellness services that benefit the individuals that we're serving, but also starting at a young age with our elementary school students, teaching some of those holistic practices, because we're looking at how increasing their protective factors and reducing their risk factors, and that shared linkage between mental health and overall wellness, how that can help to prevent substance use disorders and mental health disorders later in life.
Amazing. Thank you, Samantha. And Melissa, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do at Chesterfield?
Absolutely. So like Samantha, I'm the Prevention Services Manager at Chesterfield Community Services Board. So my department starts with a home visiting program for little ones and then kind of runs the gamut of the lifespan. probably in the last 5 years, we've had a really high focus on, honestly, death prevention, right? Opioid misuse prevention, suicide prevention. So something that really excited us about getting on board with Five Bridges was the opportunity to focus on wellness, primary prevention, and have a program that really can be used across populations. So we've been really excited to get on board with the program and have used it in a variety of ways.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. And we'll talk a lot about that integration and looking at it from a funding perspective and how to find success from that direction. So what we're going to talk about today are 4 major areas. The first is strategies. We're going to dig into the overarching strategies and some specifics related to that, like funding sources, braided funding approaches, one-time use funds, things of that nature. Then we're going to talk about logic models. I'm going to share a Five Bridges logic model that was a program logic model that was created by Virginia Tech, which is helpful just to see kind of and understand that approach. Then we'll get into a specific template that was created for funding, and we'll look at that and maybe some strategies with that. We're going to talk about outcomes and metrics and why they matter, and then a bit about lessons learned related to that as well. The third area that we're going to talk about is program sustainability. Under that, we'll talk about annual funding, staff sustainability, public relations, and how that matters for your sustainability of funding, and a for-profit approach as well. And how all of this relates to the ever important necessity to the growth of the individual, because that's why we're doing this, right? We want to serve our constituents, our community, our fellow coworkers. All of this is to that end. So holding that goal and that purpose as number one at all times is what has to inform everything. And after we're done with that, then we'll get into some questions that you might have and go from there. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about strategies. So Melissa, Samantha, can you talk each about your different funding sources? I know that you have to get really creative with your funding. So, so talk about how that looks in general.
Okay, so I've used a couple of different types of sources to fund my Five Bridges activities. Some of those have been federal funds that came through either mental health or substance use, but we, again, focused on those shared risk and protective factors that would incorporate, especially looking at the mental health side, how we can use the strategies and the bridges that are in Five Bridges, how they line up for those services and those risk and protective factors under mental health. Even for the substance use side, they were able to focus on the mental health piece, and that kind of braided that in there together by focusing on both of those, and really looking at chronic diseases, chronic illnesses, because on the prevention side of things, we are trying to change the way people think about substance use and mental health disorders because they are chronic illnesses. And so by focusing on that chronic illness piece within Five Bridges and within the way we're looking at that shift in our dynamics and our languages, we're able to fit it in that way as well. That's been on the federal side of things. But I've also applied for some grants on the local level at some of our local foundations. Again, some of these foundations have been for medical pieces. It's coming out of our hospitals and places like that. And looking at that holistic side, and though that the risk factors for chronic illnesses have allowed us to be able to receive special one-time funds through them as well to provide either, we're working towards this self-care, Five Bridges self-care fair, or we've used them to do like one-offs in like Mental Health Awareness Month and some things like that.
That's great. Thanks. Melissa, how about you?
So yeah, I've only been with Five Bridges for a little bit less than a year. So far, our funding source has been federal substance abuse prevention and mental health funds that have passed through to us. But I've had 2 offers from people to pay me, which I've not needed. And one was from the jail. So I think there's opportunity at the DJJ end with jails looking at increasing their mental health and substance use treatment and their recovery efforts. So they had money, they offered it to me, I just didn't need it. And then our county has a nonprofit called CFIT or Chesterfield, which is focused on overall wellness, the whole kind of 8 dimensions of wellness. And they have raised funds as a nonprofit, which they have also offered me. So I think it's a really easy sell because, as Samantha said, shared risk and protective factors. And we know really for any problem you're trying to address, these 5 bridges are going to be part of the solution.
And I love that we're talking so much about Five Bridges, of course, but let's talk about other programs as well, because you're all using other programs in addition to Five Bridges. Can you talk a little bit about that? And Samantha, you mentioned this braided approach to funding and programs. Can you talk about some of like how this integrates and how you're using this for your overall funding strategy?
Yes. So one of the things that we do, we have some of our staff go into middle and high schools, and they work with our students on what we call, it's tobacco prevention, but really it's all about very similar values that are being taught with Five Bridges. Those pro-social behaviors, healthier outcomes, really increasing, as we said earlier, those protective factors. So since we already have funding coming from like the Virginia Foundation for Healthy Youth, that is, they're funding the staff time, and they're already having those groups. We've been able, as a supplemental program, add Five Bridges to that particular demographic, because they're already meeting as a group for 14 weeks. And we just add, that we've been able to add this program in as, like I said, a supplemental program to it. Now, we've also been able to add it to our, on the treatment side of things, because we have a separate pot of money for treatment versus what we do for our prevention side. And that funding comes from a different space. We have, we sometimes bill for our services. Like if we go to corporations, we have what we call corporate wellness, and we'll bill those corporations for us providing wellness services to them. And so that actually helps us to fund like if we do Five Bridges or something with our treatments individuals. So we've been able to incorporate Five Bridges as one of the elements that individuals that are receiving services from Mount Rogers can also have. A lot of them come through like our intensive outpatient programs. So again, they're already meeting as a group, and we just go in and help to provide that service like one day a week to enhance some of the things that they're already doing.
That's great. And Samantha, Mount Rogers is a nonprofit organization, and yet you're able to do really a pretty broad spectrum of services for both people in the community and that corporate wellness piece. And I want to talk more about that when we get to the program sustainability. Melissa, you are working for Chesterfield County. So you're working for a governmental entity. Can you share a little bit about like how that might be different at Chesterfield and how that integration works there?
Sure. So we are part of Chesterfield's local government, which means that we need to follow their purchasing and procurement requirements, but it also means that we end up with really some generous amounts of local funds that other localities wouldn't want to. I will say that so there are our grants need approval, and our purchasing over a certain amount needs approval, and all of that. I will say we have gotten very creative in applying for grants and spending money through partnerships with our coalitions. And so that's really another avenue of partnership for funding, is working with our Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition and our Positive Parenting Coalition and our Suicide Prevention Coalition. When we work through them, often we're able to apply for different grants, a lot smaller things, like when Walmart's giving away money or Capital One's giving away money. We're able to do that in partnership with our local coalitions or in partnerships with some of our local nonprofits.
No, that's great. And let's talk a little bit about, or just dive a little deeper into this braided funding approach. So we've talked a bit about that. So my understanding, if I'm kind of getting it right, you have existing programs, you're getting funding for programs that are addressing, substance use or prevention, or working with youth, and you're able then to supplement those programs and integrate them really together to make it work, to be able to serve people in the most holistic way. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, and that is like when we got Five Bridges, we used our opioid prevention money to fund the training, but we use our Block grant money to fund the staff time to implement it. And because, as Samantha keeps emphasizing, the shared risk and protective factors, we can do that. The initiative is certainly contributing to a decrease in both of those problems.
And for those who are unfamiliar, can you differentiate those two pots of money, like where they're coming from, how that works?
I can try, and Samantha can help me. Federal money that comes through the state and then to us. One is the state opioid response money. So it's particularly focused on addressing the opioid crisis, and with an addition of meth and over-the-counter drugs now. And then the substance abuse block grant covers a broader array of substances, as well as mental health and suicide prevention. So it's really that the source is specifically focused, while the block grant is more broad. But if you're building a logic model for either of those kind of things, this fits right in there.
Yeah, and so some of our braided funding, similar to Melissa, will have like the block grant covering a lot of the staff time, but we'll have SOAR covering materials, or we'll have like the local foundation that doesn't necessarily have enough to give us for staff time. They'll help us cover the cost of a training or a workshop or the fair. That all of it working together, the outcomes are beneficial to everyone, all of these different funding sources. So it's just a matter of finding ways that we can, cover each one of the elements with a different type of funding.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And sometimes it's an in-kind contribution, right? So we don't have Zoom at our agency, but we have community partners that have Zoom, and so they take care of our registration and our technology for us. So even things like that are important.
Oh, I love that. And I love that collaboration. One of my favorite examples of collaboration that I've seen in the Southwest Virginia is between Mount Rogers and the Southwest Virginia Mental Health Institute. And for those unfamiliar, the State Mental Health Hospital there in Marion is one that has an intensive program, inpatient program. There's short-term stays, long-term stays. They have a geriatric ward, and they're really doing a lot of triage for people who have acute mental health symptoms. They're coming in, and in an initial intake setting, are being introduced to Five Bridges. For those who are staying longer, if it works into their treatment plan, then they're receiving the entire 6 weeks of Five Bridges programming through the coaching program. Regardless of how long their stay is, when they leave, as part of their wrap, Five Bridges is essentially prescribed as part of their treatment plan. So they're receiving a referral to Mount Rogers to continue working with Five Bridges through that community partnership. And if they've gone through 3 weeks of the training, for instance, at the state hospital, they get to pick up where they left off with Mount Rogers, with Samantha's group. And from there, then we work with Samantha's group to help support their work through our online virtual community, the online course, our workshops, and the community at large. So that integration, that community partnership, and that kind of seamless handoff is really a beautiful example, I think, of how we can work together within communities. And it's not just Five Bridges, right? We can do this with a lot of different types of programs. So that's, I think, the opportunity with kind of looking creatively at those partnerships and these different braided funding sources. Before we move on, let's talk real quick about one-time use funds. So we've been talking about kind of these more sustainable funds for initiating a program, for paying for staff time, for training, for that sort of thing. One-time use funds are ones that come up, every so often. Stimulus funds, or we've seen a lot come in from COVID, right? Let's talk a little bit about those one-time use funds and how you've been able to utilize those with Five Bridges and other programs to be able to really make an impact.
So some of my one-time use funds, a lot of them have come through our local foundations. Even the ones that were because of COVID and things, they, instead of running them through our town or local government, they gave them to some of our local foundations then to be able to disperse out in mini grants. And I've been able to use those specifically for mental health needs because of the rise of mental health needs that we saw during 2020 and carrying on into this year. But we've been able to do a lot of various workshops and activities, especially around like Mental Health Awareness Month and Suicide Prevention Month. We were able to get like text-based support systems in place for some of our most at-risk individuals, and really looking at ways, some of those one-time funds we've been able to put things in place for some of our shut-ins. We have a lot of areas in our community where they don't have internet, they don't have cell phone service, and they don't have great transportation. So we were able to use some of those funds, like I said, especially looking at that mental health side of things, to enhance and provide some additional services in those areas.
We kind of use our one-time use funds for capacity building and marketing efforts. So things like, training our staff, training staff in other agencies, buying licenses for programs, as far as building capacity. And then our new favorite strategy is yard signs with QR codes on them. And so we, those are durable and sustainable to some extent. And the QR codes, people can use them now because of the menus in restaurants. And so, so strategies like that, where we are taking that campaign that we're working on and planning it where people go, and having a QR code to connect them to a website or a resource, or our own page. And then we have also done some large media buys with one-time funds to just broaden our messaging.
Yeah, that's really great. And what I love is about one-time use funds is perhaps you're not ready to implement a program. Maybe you're short-staffed, maybe you're maxed out in your capacity. I think one-time use funds give you the opportunity to kind of try something out, to explore a program, to explore an approach, to see how it resonates with the community. We did that in a couple of different ways by bringing, a Five Bridges self-care fair to a community, or a lived experience speaking event. I think there's lots of different ways, that can be used and that can look. And I think it's a great opportunity to kind of try before you buy, sort of, experience a program or experience a new approach without having to commit to it fully for year over year, and see, hey, does this work for our community? Great. Let's move on to logic models. Let's talk about those. So I'm going to share my screen here, and let's see what we can find. Talk about this logic model. So as I mentioned, this is a logic model that was shared with us by Virginia Tech. So we're working with Virginia Tech to study the efficacy of Five Bridges. And they built this program logic model as an example of how we can, start to show what this looks like in different populations. So in particular, this one was built for pregnant women and mothers with children who have particular needs and challenges related to their recovery. And again, this is a program logic model. Melissa, Samantha, can you talk about how you use something like this when you are preparing to ask for funding, when you're looking at strategies?
Okay. So having the program level logic model gives me an idea of what the program expects to see in their outcomes. So like on this one, having that intermediate participants believe in and commit to the process. So just taking that top one, I then can look at my needs assessment, my community data, and say, what do I have? How is my community? What are their beliefs and commitments? And looking at that piece, what kind of sustainable change is in line with what you expect to come out of the program? So of course, like this intermediate side is mostly about that individual at that moment. You want to see it within the first 6 weeks of if they of taking the entire course. But moving into that intermediate and the what we would call long-term outcomes, where it has impact there. That's where you can really dig into that community level data. And when you are able to tie it back in your community level data with the outcomes that the program is expected to have, reviewers really take that into account, because they're seeing that you are looking at cultural competency, and that you're not just putting a program in place that's not going to have anything to do with your actual community. So it's being able to take this program level outcome and tying it to your actual needs assessments and your community level data. That's where that relationship really comes into play.
That's great.
I would just say more and more funders are asking for a logic model in advance, right? And so that we can start with what a program provides us, and then like Samantha say, tie it back to our local data. But we are seeing that as an important part of grant applications more often now.
And for me, even if they're not asking for the logic model ahead of time, if I go ahead and have my logic model created, it makes it so much easier to actually write the application, because I'm not having to dig for it later. And in that, right when I'm in the middle of writing, it's already prepared. I can just plug it in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And let's talk about that, the importance of those outcomes and metrics. So how are you, so you're taking that community data and you are um, really holding it up against a program logic model, and you're determining what outcomes, what do you want to see? How's that process look?
Okay, so in your immediate outcomes, you want to see that individual have a change in beliefs, a change in their practices, a change in behavior. So that could be something as simple as they've started exercising more. They were not exercising at all, and now they're exercising twice a week. It could be that they had no support systems listed, that they could not identify a single person, place, or thing to be in their support system. By the end, they have a support system list. They have their bond list. Those are very immediate outcomes. But what a funder, and funders enjoy that, but what they really want to see is that intermediate, there's those intermediate and long-term outcomes, because that's affecting your entire community. So by doing this program, what kind of impact is that going to have on your overall community? And so that's where you're going to look at. The intermediate is looking at it's similar to the immediate ones, but changes in beliefs and core values and things like that, but for your community. So are you seeing more people, out? Are you seeing more farmers markets in your community? Are you seeing more traffic at those farmers markets? Are you seeing more people, joining support groups? Those community level impacts show that there's been a shift. Okay. And then when you get to your long-term outcomes, that could be whatever your problem statement is. So if you're looking at your long-term outcomes and your overall goal was to decrease suicide rates amongst teenagers. So you want that long-term goal, that long-term impact, you're going to actually measure directly related to it. Did you actually see that rate decrease? And of course, those are many years of providing any strategy, program practice, or strategy in order to see that long-term outcome. And it's not just one thing. That's why logic models are so important, because as this one shows, this was a program level logic model, but when you're creating one for your agency or community, you're going to have every program, practice, and strategy that you do in that one logic model. So all of them working together will decrease your long-term goal over time, not just the one program.
So getting back into that idea of integrative, integrated, and how it all works together holistically.
Yes.
Melissa, any thoughts on this?
Now, just as Samantha was speaking, I was thinking to myself, we keep hearing that phrase. We want to, from funders, we want to see you move the needle. And that's what Samantha just talked about with, we ultimately want to see a community level change. So we're wanting to see that people, we often use like data from surveys, right? So now people are reporting, oh, there are more opportunities for pro-social involvement in my community. Oh, I have more opportunities to participate in positive activities, things like that. So I think that's important to think down the road. We know that the individual impact is so important, but more and more funders are also wanting to see, okay, how is the collective impact and the ultimate moving of a community indicator.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move over to this this example that was created. So this is an example sort of template that we provide to agencies that we work with. And you can see here that it's really focused on the CSBs, and that's who we work with a lot. But I think we can take this and use this in a lot of different settings and kind of add on to this. So this one specifically is focused on Five Bridges, and we're looking at suicide rates. Those are the challenges that we're trying to face. If this were a larger, more integrative logic model, there would be one of these sheets below, or an additional tab for each of the programs that you're working with and how they all work together. So can you talk us through this and kind of what an approach might be to something that starts to dig into your specific community data?
Okay. So again, you can see, like we put over here, that the problem statement of having a high rate of suicide and choosing specific data that comes from one of your data sources. Now, this one is taken from a state level data source, because it was going to be that way. It's generic enough for an example. But ultimately, like if you wanted to take this template, it would be good for you to look into your specific local area to find out like what this data would be. But as you can look at it and see, like from the problem tab all the way to the G column where it says long-term outcome, how those two actually go together. So you have the high rate of suicide rate, Virginia high school youth, and then your first long-term goal and your long-term outcome is to decrease in high school youth who have attempted suicide in the past year. So you can see how those two actually go together. And when you look at the next column over your B, you have your variables and your contributing factors. Those should line up with your intermediate outcomes, because that's where you're going to see that as Melissa was saying earlier, those local levels of feelings. It's more than just a state survey saying, yeah, we've seen a decrease in the number of suicides, we've seen a decrease in the number of people in the hospital. But you're getting to how your community is actually feeling, and so do they have a good rapport now? Are we seeing an increase in that? So just like here, we have high school youth reported feeling sad or hopeless. So that is a standard question on the youth risk behavioral survey, and you can do that for free within your community. You do not have to pay for that survey. And that's a standard question on it. So that's a very easy way to measure the impact of all of your strategies together, is looking at, especially that if you're working with youth, using that youth risk behavioral survey, or they have some for adults. I know Melissa and I, we use a community adult survey that was created by our state evaluators. So any of you, even if you don't work for a CSB and you're interested in getting some additional local data, your prevention people are a good place to start. And I know I'm always willing to share my data with anyone in my community, and I'm sure Melissa is too. But really, they're a good place to start, because they're required every 2 years to do a full in-depth needs assessment for their community. So you can find a lot of this data from those individuals and those departments. Like I said, even if you're not part of a CSB. And then based off of those intervening variables and contributing factors, that's where you really want to get into your strategies and activities. So on this one, of course, it has 5 Bridges to Wellness as the strategy, because that's the main one. But it's broken up into a couple of different ways that you can use that program. Now, another strategy underneath this one could be providing mental health first aid or assist, because it's all tying into the high rates of suicide. But that would be a different strategy down and different activities associated with that particular program. But the intervening variables, the short-term, long-term, especially the intermediate and long-term outcomes, they would probably be the same for that one program, because it's tying back to your intermediate outcomes.
That's great. That speaks again to that integration and how necessary it is to kind of look at how programs work together, and then opportunities to connect within your community to find the data about your community. I think that's really fantastic. Any thoughts to add, Melissa?
I'll say from the other end, I am on the grant review committees for a couple of organizations, and just the more specific and measurable we can make the logic models and the outcomes and the problems, the more favorably grant reviewers tend to look upon those things. And so that's where the concrete data, and then looking at, okay, what kind of measurable change are you going to make is helpful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great information, especially for someone like me who thinks in ideas and abstract a lot, understanding that, oh no, you still need to show those outcomes and those measures, and the more specific, the better. That's great. Let's shift gears. Oh, and by the way, I just want to mention that for anyone that we work with, this program level logic model, this template here, we work with you in a one-on-one session to customize this for your needs, to help you integrate this into your current program and funding strategies, and to make it specific for your community. So this, again, we have suicide as an example here, but there are lots of different ways that 5 Bridges is being used as an employee wellness program, for youth, for mental health treatment, as a anti-recidivism program, drug rehab. There's lots of different instances of use, and we'll help you customize it for your specific needs. Let's now wrap up with program sustainability. So we've talked a little bit about getting funding and some strategies for that. How do you keep funding? How do you make sure that these programs that you've fought so hard to get and to fund, that you can keep doing that year over year over year? Because like you talked about, Samantha, we're looking at long-term outcomes here. So we're not just talking, what's happening in a year or 2 years. We're talking 3, 5, 10 years plus down the road. What is this community impact, and how do we use these programs to do that? Melissa, can you talk a little bit about how you are really making that sustainable, how you are kind of looking at that annual funding strategy, and really like betting that you can continue to use these programs?
Yeah, part of that goes back to the question you asked earlier about how do we use our one-time funds, right? So if we can use our one-time funds for things that are one-time costs, that's awesome. Like, let's use our one-time fund to pay for training, because now once my trainers are trained, they're trained forever. And so thinking kind of with discretion about what's the best way to use this pot of money. I know I have this other pot of money that's ongoing that will sustain my staff time, regardless of what program I'm doing usually. And so that kind of thing. And then really part of it is just, I don't know how to say this other than with the success of the program, your community partners start to crave it, right? So they value it. And so now they say, I don't want that to go away. Let me be creative in how we can contribute towards the funding. And I've got some funding that can go towards this too. So I think that that's important, that as we, part of the beauty of integrating into other programs is they want to help you sustain and can get creative in funding sources to make that happen, whether it's directly paying you or jointly writing a grant, right? So we had a partnership with our detention program this summer. I'm confident they would help us write a DJJ grant, you know, if we didn't have another funding source. So those partnerships and collaborations.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and leveraging that. So let's actually, we'll just jump ahead real quick and talk about public relations, because I think that's a huge part of program sustainability. Sharing those lessons, the outcomes, the collaborations, the social proof, right? Getting those testimonials, getting those client perspectives, sharing that with the community is typically a function of marketing and outreach. How are you helping to support that PR campaign for celebrating those victories that you're having?
I'm waiting to fill my position, so I'm gonna let Samantha speak to that one.
So, you know, with our PR and working really closely with the other organizations in our community, we have found that if we're able to go in and share some of our outcomes, like, you know, we'll go ahead and have a little flyer made up of some of the outcomes that we've had from our various programs, and provide them initially with a, you know, maybe a free class or a free workshop. And, you know, we're a very tight-knit community down here. A lot of our organizations, we're willing to work together. We work together on a lot of projects. Our coalitions are, you know, they help to sustain a lot of our programming. Even if they are not able to provide us necessarily monetary things, it could be in-kind donations. They could be doing, sometimes we are able to train people in our coalitions to do certain programs, and they go ahead and they provide it, but it's helping us because they're volunteers. And so we don't have to continue to find actual financial money, you know, to help with that piece of it. You know, we may just have to find funding for program materials or, you know, something like that. But we also, you know, like with the state hospital, for example, you were talking about, you know, the collaboration I have with them. That is a great way that we've been able to sustain some of our outcomes, because not only are they referring individuals who are transitioning from inpatient to outpatient back to Mount Rogers, and I'm able to, you know, get them in lots of different services, not just Five Bridges, but anyone who's not a part of, like in the Mount Rogers service area, you know, they're going and they have the opportunity to go and do like the online course with Five Bridges. That's a good community partnership that we have. So people are still being served, just not necessarily, you know, us having to do everything. You know, I'm getting ready to start with Miss Jenny Moore on with the health department. We're getting ready to have a partnership together. We've worked with a lot of our schools to help train our teachers, because, you know, their self-care is in such a need right now because they're being asked to do a lot of new things. So we're doing a lot of integrative work with people across and organizations across all various different types of sectors. And I have found that regardless of the type of program, if it is beneficial and they're seeing outcomes with their staff or their individuals that they're serving, then there's the potential there that we could actually go in together the next time a grant comes up, or, you know, that another funding cycle needs to be, you know, a licensing fee for whatever program it is needs to be purchased, that we might actually be able to go in together and share the cost of that burden. And that's been very beneficial.
I will say with the marketing piece, and I joked, but it's true, like I've been without a marketing person, sadly, the entire pandemic. That has been great because Jacob's team has developed some materials for me. And so I popped an example down there in the chat box about just kind of saying, hey, does your wellness plan include these things? If not, go see prevention services about it. So that's awesome. And then you also prompted me to think about, as far as sustainability goes, there's that piece about how am I using my resources, right? And so right now I have financial resources for staff time. My staff can go out and teach Five Bridges directly in a lot of settings. If that money ran out or my staff time needed to be used differently, then I would just direct everyone to the Five Bridges website to take their classes there. And so the programs we're best able to sustain are programs that have flexibility in service delivery and model versus the ones that are really rigid about those kind of things.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. I'm downloading that poster, or I can actually let you screen share if you want to screen share as that example. But while that's happening, let's talk about that staff sustainability piece, because I know that that's a challenge. I know that both of you have had job openings that you have not been able to fill because there's such a shortage of staff right now, and it's not just in the nonprofit sectors. We're seeing it all over the place. So how are you able to navigate that? It's really a challenge. Melissa, you mentioned that the great thing is once someone's trained, they're trained, right? That's fantastic. So that gives you that opportunity. What are your strategies for program sustainability from a staffing perspective?
Also try to cross train. So making sure that we have a variety of staff that are available to sub in as needed, and then the pieces about having the options about presenting virtually or in person has been really important based on what's going on in people's lives and obviously in the community. So that's been important. And then building the capacity of our partners has been important so that when we are short-staffed, there are partners that we can rely on that we know will help us with the things that we perhaps can't do, particularly when they're technical or they're marketing or something that's outside of just kind of the clear mental health lens.
Yeah, that's great. How about you, Samantha? Any tips for staff sustainability?
So similar to Melissa, we do a lot of those similar things. And I already talked about how we like to work with volunteers and our coalition members. But we also do a lot of work with interns because we're able to, yes, they're going to be rotating in and out, but we like to make sure that we have 2 people going in if we're going to do any type of group setting. You like to have 2 staff on site at all times. So we'll use a lot of our interns to help with that. That does help with sustainability. And really trying to find ways to lessen the burden that are on staff, our current staff, because they're working so hard. And I think that goes back to Melissa saying, like, where you cross train, so they can help to share some of that workload, because we're asking them to do a lot of additional work. But yeah, finding ways that they can share that with each other and not feel like any one person has to do it all.
I think that the cross-training and the diversification of the kind of work that people are doing, we became really aware of this term trauma stewardship during the pandemic, that when we are really heavily invested in helping others through really messy stuff, that inherently weighs us down. So diversifying the work that my staff do, so they're not only talking about Revive and and what to do if someone has thoughts of suicide, but also get to talk about bonds and fuel and wellness, I think helps with staff morale and preventing burnout and retention.
Yeah, and that's something we hear a lot about Five Bridges, and that I really appreciate the feedback on, because we're not talking about death and addiction and all the really hard stuff that is necessary to talk about. However, we focus on wellness, and we focus on positive strategies and approaches to sustainable wellness, and how can we disrupt those patterns of behavior, and how can we recover from trauma and build resilience in order to prevent, in order to see that sustainable growth. That shift in thinking, I think, is really helpful in general, and sort of that creative divergent thinking is what you're doing, right? Already with looking at different funding techniques, the integrations of different programs, leveraging partnerships, and being able to really look at that big picture. That's something that we're committed to at Five Bridges, is really becoming a part of your team. So I'll share this example that Melissa sent. This is a poster that we created for Chesterfield County to promote the Five Bridges program and the training sessions, coaching sessions that they had coming up. We're an extension of your team. So whether it's marketing and outreach materials, or you need an extra hand coaching, actually, just last week, I jumped in with a group that Melissa's team was coaching. Can you share about that, Melissa?
I would love to. So we have been teaching Five Bridges in our jail's addiction recovery program. And we had been teaching rest, and there was Jacob's like in one of the pictures. And one of the participants said, wow, he looks really chill or really relaxed or something like that. And we said, oh, that's the program founder, Jacob Moore. Would you like us to invite him to join us next session? And so we reached out to, and they did, they very much wanted to, and they thought it was cool. And we knew, that Jacob has a story of such resilience that could really be a message of hope to the people in our program. And so we reached out to Jacob and said, hey, can we Zoom you in next time? And he said, sure, I'd be happy to. So we Zoomed him in, and he taught the final lesson, the give lesson. It's also the great part about having a curriculum that has some fidelity to it, right? Is that Jacob could do that. He could pop in for the 5th session, and he could have confidence about what Rebecca and I talked about the other 4, and could build on that. And we knew what he was going to say for the most part. And so, yeah, that was awesome. They loved it, and we loved it.
Yeah, it was a really great experience, and just to see the group and how they responded, and the fact that they were speaking the Five Bridges language. And like you said, like I hadn't had any interaction with them before. They're in an incarcerated situation, but I was able to Zoom in and still connect, and we were speaking the same language. That's a beautiful thing for me. And it all comes back. All of this comes back to that number one core value imperative of what we're doing, which is the growth of the individual, right? We want to continue to invest in that, and that is informing everything we do, the programs that we're building, how we're supporting, how it's integrating, how the funding works. It's all about that end goal of how can we best serve people and help them. So with that, I just want to talk about one last thing, which is this idea of a for-profit approach, because we have so many, nonprofit organizations that we work with, but this for-profit mindset, I think, is an interesting perspective for growth and sustainability and development of the program. So, Samantha, I know you have a unique approach to that that you're able to do at your organization, but I think there are lessons from it that we can apply to other sectors as well.
Yes, so I provide, like as I said earlier, corporate wellness services. And I have a couple of staff who are dedicated to going out and building relationships with, like our manufacturing plants and big businesses in the area that are for-profit industries and have funding to pay people. And we provide an array of wellness services. Five Bridges is one of them, but there are lots of different services that we have to offer. And, they have a tier system. But when someone signs on and we're able to, incorporate some of that funding that we receive from them, we build just enough to help us sustain the staff time and stuff in those wellness services. So, it's still as a not-for-profit, we're not making any money, but it is helping us to sustain the staff time or potentially like a licensing fee or anything like that, material costs that would come out of for those services. And then we're able to not only provide it for those corporations, but to cover some things on the treatment side, because all of the grants that I've received so far have been on the prevention, federal prevention funding. And so because of that, you can't use those for treatment, anyone in receiving treatment services. So yes, we've had to be, again, braided and flexible about how we're, blending those together. But yes, so anyone who's being served in our treatment side is, the funding is coming out of that specific piece. But with enough services in there from those corporate wellness, we're able to sustain the services that we're already offering. And here's hoping that we can then build on and include additional services. But for now, it's at least helping to sustain what we already have. And I think it's really important, especially like when tying this back into grant writing, when you're writing about your sustainability piece. Yes, we're talking a lot about how we're sustaining it with our agencies, how we're sustaining a specific program, but we also want to make sure that we're talking about how we're sustaining it for the outcomes for our individuals. And what does that look like? So even if you're not able to continue providing funding for a specific program, have you made enough changes in your community that's going to be there to protect the individuals that you have served? So have you worked with people, and that goes back to that community partnership as well. Have you worked with people at your local churches perhaps, or the schools? Melissa, working with the jails and stuff, like all of those, having those community partners help to sustain the outcomes for your individuals, regardless of if you have funding for a program.
I love that, Samantha. So you're saying, how do we sustain a cultural shift? Yeah, that's
yes.
Well, and it takes all members, all stakeholders from the community to be able to do that. And that's why I love to include this idea of, thinking like a for-profit company, because you're leveraging those relationships. And even if you can't bill for services to a for-profit company, can you partner with them? Can they sponsor an event? Can they bring in the principles that support the work that you're doing? Because chances are they're employing people that you serve. So there's so much cross-pollination that happens, whether it's, service agencies, for-profit companies, the churches, the schools, it's all one community. So to start to look at, hey, what are the in-kind opportunities here? What are the sponsorship opportunities here? How can we work collectively? And I think that's the overall lesson here. Well, Samantha, Melissa, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all of your insight and your wisdom. It's been fantastic hearing from you today, and more so working with you. I really appreciate it. For anyone out there who is interested in doing the kind of work that we do together, I would encourage you to reach out. schedule a 15-minute call. There's a link somewhere by this video where you can do that. And we'll talk more about how to find sustainable funding for your programs and for your community. Thanks very much.